Joining me now is Ambassador Dennis Ross, former special assistant to President Obama for the Mideast region and an NBC News foreign affairs analyst. Ambassador Ross, I appreciate your being here on this day. U.S. officials are telling NBC News that President Biden's message to the prime minister, to Netanyahu, included a warning that the U.S. would consider conditioning military aid unless Israel makes immediate changes to address humanitarian concerns in Gaza and unless Israel agrees to a ceasefire as soon as possible. I just want to get your reaction to that warning. And how soon do you think Netanyahu really has to act, to respond?
Well, I think there's really two different issues here. One is, I think the president's looking for some kind of clear demonstration that Israel is doing more, not just to facilitate humanitarian assistance going into Gaza, because actually I think more humanitarian assistance actually is going into Gaza. But I think what the president's looking for is much more direct Israeli action to ensure that there isn't chaos on the delivery, that there's security for the delivery, that if humanitarian assistance is going in, doing more to create an environment where those who need it are actually getting it. I think that's something that the administration and the president will be watching to see, number one. Number two, I think on the issue of the ceasefire, it's tied to an agreement with Hamas. Now, the problem is last week, Hamas rejected a proposal Bill Burns made, which the Israelis had accepted. What it suggests to me is that within Israel, there has been a fair amount of reporting that the negotiators for Israel on the hostage deal haven't been given the mandate that they feel they should have been given. Whether they're the ones letting that be known or others who know them are saying that, not clear. But it is interesting to me that the president picked up on that, because up until now, that's really not been anything that we have suggested. So that too indicates that this is an issue that the president's kind of attuned to on the one hand, but also is quite mindful that it's a domestic issue within Israel. And it's a different way to put pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu.
So that is an interesting point that you flagged there. I do want to ask you specifically about this threat that military aid, could be conditioned as a consequence. Does that have teeth? I mean, Israel right now does not need any more new American aid. I recognize it would be symbolic, but would that actually have any real impact?
Well, as it relates to Gaza, probably not. But Israel right now has canceled leave of all of their military because they're on a high alert in anticipation of some kind of an attack by Iran. As a result of, even though Israel didn't admit it, they were the ones who took out maybe the most important Revolutionary Guard leader since Qasem Soleimani in their attack in Damascus a couple of days ago. And it's clear Iran is saying Israel's going to pay a price for this. So the fact that you could see some kind of expansion of conflict either coming out of Lebanon and Hezbollah, or something that's triggered by the Iranians, or some of its proxies, maybe with barrage attacks from Iraq or Syria, that gets you into a situation where if Israel is fighting a wider war, even beyond what we've seen now, then some kind of hold of American military assistance would be an issue.
Right.
Although I hasten to add, the president was pretty clear in the statement released by the White House that when it comes to threats from Iran, the United States is going to be there with Israel.
Let me ask you, if I can, we talk about this being a tense back and forth between these two men. Obviously, in some ways, they have really competing interests here. Do you get the sense that the Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu, has really been trying to just see how far he can push the U.S. in recent weeks about the limits of its support? What is Netanyahu's calculation right now?
I think the calculation is driven more by his own domestic needs. He has a coalition where the people on the right, who are the ones who he has the greatest concern about possibly leaving the government and therefore bringing it down, they're the ones who are insisting less responsiveness to us, even tougher approach in Gaza, going into Rafah now, don't waiting on it. And I think what he's been doing, he's been posturing himself towards them. I would just flag for you one key indicator that Israel really didn't intend to go into Rafah anytime soon anyway.
Yeah.
They agreed all along that they had to evacuate Palestinians who were crammed into the Rafah area. Well, if they're really trying to send a message to Hamas as opposed to a kind of public posture, you would have seen that evacuation begin. That would have been an indicator they were preparing for an attack. Mm-hmm. There hasn't been any evacuation that's begun yet. So that's why I say I see this as much more public posturing towards his own domestic needs and the needs of his coalition, and probably the attitudes of the public more generally, given what their view of Hamas remains. But I think less sort of posturing towards President Biden, although it has that consequence.
I was going to say, and just to be clear, Mr. Ambassador, part of the tension that existed in a call earlier this week between the White House and Israeli leaders was over this issue of how the Israelis proposed dealing with Rafah, 1.4 million Palestinians there, and the Israelis were proposing basically making them move in a matter of days or weeks, which the U.S. said was simply not feasible. It wasn't doable. I want to ask you quickly about the growing calls right now. Even members of the War Cabinet are calling for some early elections. Benny Gantz wants to see them held in September. That news coming out within the last 24 hours or so. Netanyahu says elections during a war could paralyze the country. Could new elections in Israel restore trust in the government? Is there any possibility that happens, and how big of a difference maker could that be in this circumstance?
If you look at the polls in Israel, 70% of the Israeli public do not trust this government. So that's a pretty clear indicator of why the prime minister probably doesn't want early elections, number one. Number two, I would say Benny Gantz on his own can't bring the government down, but there is this issue with the draft of the ultra-religious, and subsidies for them have been cut off.
It really threatens Netanyahu's coalition,
It does. And it may be that what you see Gantz doing is making this call because this may be part of the maneuvering with the ultra-religious to see, would they support this in return for some kind of interim measures to preserve subsidies for their yeshiva students. A lot of maneuvering going on. Watching Israeli politics for lots of years, I would say, don't assume anything just yet. I'm not betting just yet that we're going to have elections by September, but I wouldn't be surprised either.
This has been a hugely consequential and challenging time on all sides. Ambassador Dennis Ross, we appreciate your expertise and your perspective. Thanks for making time for us.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.